This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Thank you. So I enjoy speaking, and I appreciate you're all coming so that we can explore this topic together. It sometimes takes me a little while to meander into the heart of the subject. I do have a sense of what I want to cover, but a lot of it can be geared and shaped to different ways, and that depends on you and where your interests are and what you kind of pull out from all of the ground we could cover. So right off the bat, I'd like, just for informational purposes for myself, just by a show of hands, how many people here are comfortable with the use of the word soul? Okay, that's good. How many people are, the topic is releasing the soul on 4 levels, okay? So we have the individual, family, ancestral, collective, and planetary. The part that Bridget was mentioning in terms of the Hellinger Family Constellations specifically and most directly addresses the family level, but really I've worked on all the levels, and especially the individual level, for much longer. And so I'm curious, how many people have, if you do, have a particular interest on the individual level? All right, how many people came mainly out of curiosity about the Hellinger family level? Anyone? Okay. And anyone particularly intrigued on the collective levels? Doesn't really matter, you'll get my version of all of them. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some basic ideas or definitions of the soul in the way I understand it. And I'll be drawing a lot from this particular book for that. And this is a book called The Inner Journey Home, The Soul's Realization of the Unity of Reality by a teacher named Almaas. How many people here, if anyone's familiar with Almaas? Okay. So for those of you who are going to be daunted to ever tackle a book of this size, I'm going to try to summarize some of it and share a little bit about my experience in working with him. And I will also interweave in the Hellinger work. So we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of the soul, what are the inherent qualities of the soul. The quote that I used to begin the description of the talk is from a book called Esoteric Healing by Alice Bailey, in which she lays out all the rules and principles and laws of esoteric healing. And the very first law, and the one she emphasizes over and over again, she says the first law of healing on all levels is that the art of the healer is to release the soul so that its life can flow. So that already implies certain things about the soul, doesn't it? That it has flow or movement, ideally. And so we're going to explore what that looks like on these various levels, and immediately then we'll have to look at the question, well, what blocks that flow or that movement? Okay, so that's some of the ground I want to cover. And then a lot of what comes out of that will then depend on questions and response, which way we gear it. After the break, I do want to, in addition to answering questions, I do want to actually lead a meditation in which people can have this experience of the soul presence. So the word soul can be used in a lot of different ways. The most important thing out of all I've said, the most important thing I want to get to through this talk that I'll be meandering into in various ways is, why is the soul level even important? What do we miss if we ignore or don't acknowledge the soul level? Because not all spiritual traditions or teachings do, and certainly not modern science or modern psychology does. And in my own life, I was very intrigued always by psychology and trying to understand why we do what we do. And by temperament, by tendency, I would have very easily have gotten a PhD in transpersonal psychology and set up shop and been quite happy. But my soul had other purposes in mind for me. And so every time I thought about going to get that PhD, it was like, no, that's not it, because I was already quite developed in the mind, and that's what this culture supports and reinforces. And so in my own journey, what became clear was that what's essential is the development of the spiritual heart. And the heart and soul overlap. Whenever you talk about the soul's realm, you'll start talking about the heart's realm. So they kind of interpenetrate. My first teacher was a guru named Adi Da, or at that time, Da Free John. He's used different names. I don't know, how many people are familiar with Adi Da? A little bit at least, okay. And he used to call his teaching various things, including the way of the heart. And so through that teaching, I became very aware of the fact that my heart was quite defended. And what I was led to as my path, rather than getting this PhD in transpersonal psychology, was to work and learn a soul-level healing process called Self Attunement. And so that's what I was first certified in and first worked with soul-level healing around. So part of what you hear will be coming from that. And my teacher in that process had a very low opinion of book learning. He felt that people in the West especially read all sorts of books, had all sorts of spiritual ideas, and didn't come enough from their own experience. So the self-attunement training was completely experiential. It was basically extended meditation times where we did our own inner work and learned how to be simply present. And in that presence, to allow whatever was to be felt and acknowledged and then unfold. And I'm going to tie that in when we get to what blocks that. So that became an important journey of awakening for myself. And one of the very few books or anything that my teacher recommended was this guy named Almaas. And this was years ago, and Almaas hadn't published all of his numerous books, but he had published a book called Essence. And that was the one book that we were encouraged to read to help us understand our own training. And the notion of essence is that, how do I want to describe this? It's like we have a physical, emotional, and mental body that comprise our personalities. And that is intended to be the soul's vehicle of expression in the physical world. And what happens for most of us, I'd say pretty much all of us, is that we come to identify with our personality and lose the awareness and the freedom of the soul, okay? And so part of that recovery of true identity is a recovery of what is called in the Sufi tradition. Almaas comes out of the Middle East, so he draws a lot on Sufi teaching, and is essence. And essence is what is actually real, kind of ontologically real, if you want to use that word. And so the personality, which at its core inevitably feels an underlying deficient emptiness. Does this make sense to people? This underlying deficient emptiness, because it's come to identify with this structure of the personality and lost touch with essence. So spiritual growth becomes the great discovery, the eureka moment when you actually notice that there's essence, that there's this presence when you simply can be, okay? Essence does not change or develop. Essence already is complete, already is what it is, right? It doesn't change or unfold, but our understanding, our awareness, our experience of it grows and change when we allow the soul's free movement. It's the soul that grows and develops. It grows and develops, okay? Are you with me on this much, kind of the rudimentaries? Okay, so anyway, this started me off on a process of also working and training with Almaas along the way. And so I'm going to read out some of what he talks about, just so we'll be on the same page in terms of the soul. So there's different ways he describes it. One is that the soul is the organ of experience, an organism of consciousness, and a field of conscious presence. And I like to think of it, and he describes it this way as well, as a multi-dimensional interpenetrating fields of awareness. And this is where we start to get to the understanding of the levels, that the soul is multi-dimensional and those dimensions interpenetrate one another, okay? And this is one of the insights that you run across, is that the deeper into the so-called individual psyche you go, the less individual it becomes, and the more collective and impersonal it becomes. And so this is where you start then to get to Hellinger's recognition of how completely affected and intertwined with the family level and collective levels that we are. So this individual soul is a myth in a certain sense, and yet there is a field, nonetheless, of the individual soul. So after first just talking about some of the definitions of the soul, let's say. Oh, and by the way, you know how in shamanic work, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I hope you'll stay with me, we'll get to it. You know how in shamanic work they talk about soul retrieval, and they talk about losing your soul and then having to retrieve your soul. I just wanted to clarify that in my understanding and in the body of work I'm coming from, the understanding of soul is not something that can be lost, okay? You can't lose it. It is who you are. But poetically, nonetheless, to talk about soul loss, to talk about someone who is without soul or someone who has lost their soul, someone who is soulless, is very descriptive and very helpful. And we all kind of have an intuitive sense of what that means, even though we might be hard-pressed to spell it out. I remember years ago when I lived in Chicago, there was this really odd experience where there were some people from the rainforest who somehow these museums arranged to bring them to America and take them on tour to various museums that had constructed little like surrogate villages for them to live in. Did any of you participate in this? And anyway, it was really interesting. Here these people, they'd never been out of, the rainforest, and they were suddenly plopped down in, modern America, in these modern cities, spending their days living in the museum, letting people come and observe them, and then going out. And I remember they were asked, like in Chicago, they were quite impressed with the glass elevators and different things like that. But when they were asked, what is your impression of people here, their responses were a people who have lost our soul. And I've always remembered that, so we all kind of have an awareness of what it means to have soul. And it's different than what it means to be self-realized, isn't it? It's a different quality. It's a different, in the Hellinger work, if you read it, he'll talk about the difference between spiritually aware and those who have developed what he calls soul weight. So in terms of spirituality, we think of being light is good, but he talks about a soul who has developed weight, capacity, the ability to carry its fate. And that's a different quality that you sense in someone, So all of this is ways of saying that part of why it's so important to know and honor the soul level is it turns out it's the soul level that honors the human level, okay? It's the soul level that gives the capacity to become a human being with heart, with a richness, with the capacity of what in the Sufi tradition was called the perfected man. And so I'm going to read you at some point a quote about that points to kind of a difference from the spiritual image of the guru or the saint that we've come down to this notion of the perfected human being, okay? So after he kind of plays with the definitions of the soul, he talks about 5 basic properties of the soul. And one property is the capacity to be aware. okay? Because the soul is an organism of consciousness, it's like we have the capacity to become conscious because the very nature of our soul is consciousness itself, okay? Consciousness being, well, so we'll just say that. Another property of the soul is that it has this pure potentiality, okay? Has a great capacity for a whole range of potential experience. The third property of the soul is what he calls morphing dynamism. Morphing dynamism is kind of like, given the opportunity, the soul will be ceaselessly changing, ceaselessly unfolding, okay? Always giving rise to the next moment, the new experience, the next step, the next opportunity, whatever it is. So there's this inherent dynamism in the nature of the soul. The fourth property of the soul is its impressionability, or what he also talks about, the malleability and the extreme sensitivity. And this is going to be what we talk most about, because this becomes both our great gift and our great challenge, because this ends up being what, in a sense, blocks the dynamism of the soul. Okay? So we're going to talk most about this property. But just to round it out then, the fifth property of the soul is that it's a living presence. And it's a living presence that does evolve, that does grow and change. So unlike if you go, say, to a satsang where the emphasis is on self-realization, the emphasis there is on what is unchanging, what doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And therefore, in that realm, any realm of story, which inevitably has beginning, middle, end, has development, is only blocking your realization of that unchanging truth. Do you see that? And yet we're all continually involved and interested in the changing realm. And that is the soul's realm, because it is the soul that takes the journey. It's the soul that has the opportunity to grow and develop. Okay? Does that make sense to people? So if we back up here and we look at impressionability, it is the nature of the soul to be extremely sensitive and malleable. And in terms of qualities or substances that the soul has been compared to, sometimes it's compared to mercury, which you can put into a container and it will take a shape, but as soon as it's out of the container, that it totally changes. You know, it's a very fluid, can be defined by all sorts of structures, but is in itself completely malleable. So he'll talk in terms of that image. He'll also talk in terms of the image of silly putty. If you remember silly putty as a kid, you could imprint all sorts of things on silly putty and then reshape it and imprint something else. And so that is the nature of the soul. We all come into this life extremely sensitive and extremely vulnerable. And initially, the experience of the soul as an infant in human form is one of extreme dependency, and is one of an experience where all of our needs seem to be met from the outside. If an infant is hungry, it's dependent on the mother to feed it. If the infant needs its diaper changed, it's dependent. Do you see that? And so what Almaas presents is that this initial experience that we all go through creates a very deep, lasting impression or imprint on the soul, which is what I need is outside me. And this begins an external orientation right away. Do you see that? I mean, that's really simple, but it's profound when you think about it, you know? And so we become, before we're conscious of it, our very experience over and over again is that our needs are met from the outside world. And this creates a strong imprint of what is traditionally called the desire nature, constantly desiring for something outside of yourself. And that continues then to imprint on the soul level. And that becomes part in the family constellation of what makes us so vulnerable as well to our parents and to our family situation, because we're totally dependent and we're automatically oriented towards what's outside of us and what's around us, okay? So in a certain sense, when you talk about if we talk that the role of the healer is to free up the flow of the soul, and then you say, well, what blocks the flow of the soul? There's a whole range of things. Some is what we could call the unhealthy or extreme form. I'm not sure if those are the right words. But in other words, any kind of trauma or abuse will dramatically imprint the soul in a very frozen way. So that instead of morphing into this new potential and the freedom to unfold in new ways, any kind of trauma or abuse literally freezes the body, the emotions, and the minds, totally freezes the organism at all levels to simply keep reacting from that frozen impression. So that makes for really extreme forms of rigidity and fear and body armoring and all that kind of thing. But even aside, let's say you had no extreme trauma and your parents were not abusive and you grew up in basically a loving circumstance. Why is it that we still notice that personalities as personalities tend to become quite rigid, quite set in their ways? In fact, there's a brilliant section in this book where he talks about what replaces all the impressionability. I don't know if I can find my notes on that. But these are the various defenses that we all develop. It's almost like because we are so vulnerable, because we are so sensitive at the soul level, and because we've all experienced difficulties with that, we tend to set up defenses. We don't want to be so malleable and impressionable to those around us. And so all sorts of defenses come into play, which again, some embody more rigidly than others, but every personality by definition has. So the need to be in control, the tendency to be controlling in all the various ways that arises, that is a defense against this underlying sensitivity. Rigidity, whether it's bodily rigidity and tension, whether it's emotional armoring, defensiveness, or mental like being opinionated and attached to your viewpoint and unable to yield, all of that gives the lie to how open or free we are at the personality level. Willfulness, having a strong sense of wanting to have your way, get your way, that's a defense against impressionability. The protection of isolation and withdrawal, just trying to want to withdraw from people or avoid people, that's a way that we protect ourselves from this feeling of being too much influenced at some level. Any kind of feeling of compulsive autonomy, which is interesting in this country because this country so much values independence and autonomy that we can look at that as great success. But on a healing aspect, have to be compulsively autonomous or independent is to lose out on the freedom and the full spectrum of feeling safe to be open and vulnerable. And so there's a whole range, and we all know that. And so even in a, quote, healthy development of the personality is by definition somewhat of a limitation on the free ability of the soul to unfold. Is everyone with me on this much? Okay. Is there any questions or clarifications before I try to move it to the next? Uh-huh.
I've always been intrigued by the contrast between spirituality and soulfulness.
Uh-huh.
So I wonder if you just could maybe give your viewpoint about that a little bit, because just to make it a little more concrete, I meet a lot of people, especially around here, who are spiritual, but I don't necessarily perceive them as being soulful. Mm-hmm. And I have a very kind of a visceral feeling about that difference myself. And I could, do my own little characterization of those two qualities. But I just wonder, I'd like to get your viewpoint about that.
Okay. Yeah, that is a point I wanted to cover anyway, so someplace I probably have notes on it. Well, I'm going to play with this in a couple different ways. So one useful, simple perspective is to say that the personality is the realm of separation. To the extent that we believe we are this body and encased in it, what Adida always called the meat body. But to the extent that we feel that what is inside this skin is me and what is outside this skin isn't me, we're identified with the personality level, and that's the realm of separation. And to be separate is inherently to be fearful and in pain at some level, which we're very good at covering over with all sorts of strategies. But the personality is inherently a realm of separation. The self is the realm of oneness. The self is oneness. The soul is the realm of interconnectedness. The soul is the realm in which everything and everyone is interconnected, which isn't quite the same thing as one. Okay? And that interconnectedness is part of why, again, this interpenetrating fields of awareness come into play. So sometimes, this is a little aside, but sometimes when people come, like, say, to a family constellation work, the experience there is that an individual can set up a constellation, and other family members who are not present physically and not even told about the fact that the constellation occurred will nonetheless later call or do something that shows that they've been impacted by the constellation work that was done. And people always love that. People always say, wow, that's amazing, that's wonderful, but how does that work? How can that work when they're not even there? Well, you see, on the soul level, the soul is not limited in time and space in the way the body is. And so at the family soul level, there's complete interconnectedness. And that's why you can heal and have that healing extend into the past and into the future. So that's quite amazing. So that's one of the things about the soul. You know how in the experience, this goes back to transcendence. In a certain sense, transcendence is associated with spirituality. So spirituality, when you have that awareness where the separate sense totally dissolves and you're just beingness itself, there's this awesome awareness, but there's this feeling of not needing anyone or anything because everything dissolves into this oneness of this loving presence that just is that. So in and of itself, like in the East where there's that emphasis on transcendence, you'll see yogis will sometimes stand in weird positions and let their fingernails grow all out and everything to show their utter and complete indifference to the body, right? Or there's this, and there is, in terms of the absolute is equally as happy sitting in a palace or sitting on a garbage heap, which is another thing some of the yogis have done, go and just hang out on garbage heaps to show, again, utter indifference to outer circumstance. The great sage who was a very important teacher in my experience, Sri Ramana Maharshi, same thing, he was totally indifferent as to whether he ate or didn't eat, anything like that, which is that transcendent realm. It doesn't care what happens, if someone lives or dies, is equally okay. And that's a powerful realization, but it doesn't end up being very satisfying to the human heart. And one of the things that Almaas talks about is that the truth is satisfying to all parts of us. And at the level of the human heart is where we come back to the soul level. The soul level is what, if you're concerned about the state of the world, or you're concerned about wanting to experience more peace or more love, really you're concerned about a soul unfoldment. Do you see that? So part of the richness, like in indigenous cultures where they really emphasized and lived the soul awareness, like in Martine Prechtel's book, how many people have read that? Secrets of the Talking Jaguar is one of his books, where he talks a lot about the Mayan experience of the soul realm. And he talks about how the Mayan elders, every time they developed a new quality, a new level of themselves, a new skill, they would be able to wear like an additional color. And when you died and were buried, it was kind of like the more layers of colorful clothing you had, the more you were being honored as a human, as a rich, ripe human being who had realized all these aspects, okay? So that's part of the richness and the ripeness then of that soul level capacity. And it again goes back to this question of the heart as well, becoming a person with heart. And one way to maybe get to this as well is the Sufis evidently had a teaching that Almaas draws on a lot, and it's certainly present in other traditions as well, which is the notion that the human being is the intersection between the animal soul, what's usually called the animal soul, the human soul, and the angelic soul. And that the perfected man, or the complete man, is one who has realized and integrated all three levels, okay? And the impressionability of the soul exists on all three levels. And that is what starts to get to an explanation of not only what we're capable of in our full glorious potential, but what we're capable of that we see smeared across the daily news all the time. Because the animal soul, or what he ends up calling the desire soul, is also impressionable and also becomes limited at the soul level in a way that animals themselves don't experience. That's why some people object to it being called the animal soul, because they say, well, human beings end up acting worse than animals, which, you know, is true. So for those of you who are animal lovers and object to it being called the animal soul, we could call it the desire soul. But it is that level within us that is totally taken up with basic needs of survival, and will do anything to meet those needs, okay? And so it's what in psychological work is usually somewhat talked about under the term of integrating the shadow side. Not exclusively, but somewhat. So this whole notion that the deeper into the soul you go when you're doing inner work, the more you run across these primitive levels. And if you only have a kind of angelic spiritual orientation, you're going to want to keep those primitive levels under wrap. And yet, if you're going to release the full potential of the soul for the full range of realization, you have to be open to letting all of that come up. Do you see that? And so sometimes this gets to some of the basic approach, whether it is through the attunement training I did, whether it's the Almaas's work, whether it's through the Hellinger work. A lot of how you release the soul's movement, since that's the topic we're talking about, it isn't, and this is how the personality inevitably wants to do something. And the personality inevitably wants to make something happen. And now we're going to heal, or now I'm going to release my issue with feeling unworthy, or now, you know what I mean? The ego or the personality is always wanting to be in charge and think that it's going to do something. So when we're talking about releasing the soul to flow, right away we have to say, okay, we're not talking about going in and doing something. Okay, because it's only the mind or the ego that could think that it knows what to do. But because there is this inherent morphing dynamism to beingness, the magic and the trick is, on all levels, is if you can simply attend to what is. If you can simply, one of Hellinger's books, I've got it here someplace, is called Acknowledging What Is. Or in the attunement training, it's simply to attend. Oh, here we have it. I saved your seat with it. So here's one of Bert Hellinger's books that I recommend as a good beginning book to read if you're interested in reading on it, and it's called Acknowledging What Is. In the attunement process, we called it attending to, Simply being present, feeling energetically whatever is there, and simply attending to it. Not trying to change it, simply feeling it or simply acknowledging it. In Almaas's work, he calls it inquiry. He says you have to just keep inquiring into your moment-to-moment experience, not with the idea of changing it, not with the idea of, oh, I've read that spiritually you should feel unconditional love, so I'm going to try to feel love. What you do is you simply keep inquiring into what is. In soul level work, there are movements that are sometimes made, but it's not like a formula. It's not like, oh, if this happens, then have the person do this movement, and then like magic, something happens. It's a process of listening and noticing on whatever level of soul you're working with what already is. And simply acknowledging that is what allows the movement. Now, the neat thing about a constellation is you get an outer reflection of that, which makes it very, very powerful. But whether you're experiencing it quietly with your eyes closed in an attunement session or in your own inner exploration, or whether you're experiencing it in a workshop where the movement is externalized outside, both are important and powerful, and both, simply in that acknowledgement of what is, allows the inherent dynamism of being to unfold the experience the way it needs to unfold, free of the personality's interference. Do you see that? So that's a big difference, and that's a huge turning point on the spiritual path, because inevitably, we try to apply our idea of what spirituality is rather than simply trusting. So in the end, Almaas says the one quality that will take you all the way, so to speak, is devotion to truth. And not truth as an idea of what you've already read and now tried to encapsulize, but the truth as it's manifesting and unfolding moment to moment, to simply keep being curious, to inquire into your experience. And if something is stuck, to be interested as to why that is, and then acknowledge that. And that is what allows the soul's inherent ability to unfold, to come forth. Do you see that? So all of those are different ways that the soul level understanding is different and reaches this different emphasis. Maybe in a moment I'll see if I can find some of the quotes I wanted to share with you. Go ahead.
Can you tell me, is there a difference between soul and spirit?
In the way I'm using it, there is. Although I wouldn't want to be pinned down to exactly how to define spirit. And you could use certain things interchangeably, like sometimes when they talk about the Holy Spirit in terms of the Trinity of the Holy Spirit, then that would be a little different. But the main distinction I'm trying to make is more between the soul level dynamism and the unchanging field of, or the unchanging realm. Let's just leave it that way.
Well, talking about Gita made me feel sort of like, I can understand it when it says in there that you are the soul. You've always been, you always will be. You're an immortal soul. So that always made me feel sort of like secure, that hey, the soul lives forever, some part of me isn't going to be dead, that sort of thing. And I used to be in an esoteric class that focused a lot with Bailey and Blavatsky and others, and in it, I finally had a couple mantras. One was spirit is truth, and the other mantra was persona, get thee behind me, I the soul shall lead. So for 10 years I would say those things. They would sort of free me a little bit when I would get myself into little situations.
Yeah, like a couple things for me. In the Course in Miracles, there's a quote where they talk about what is real cannot be destroyed, what is unreal will eventually fall away. And that very simple quote used to, stand me in good stead when I was going through something difficult. It was like, it just helped you trust. There's, I'm going to throw out just, one of the many things that Almaas addresses in his work that I find interesting is he talks about what he calls the main contradiction between the man of the world and the man of spirit. And he says, all spiritual teachings and traditions emphasize that the individual self is not important. Some say that it's an illusion and really doesn't exist, ultimately. And others say, well, yes, it exists, but it's unimportant and in need of redemption and only finds its fulfillment through submission to something else. And obviously that all represents a lot of important truth. So he's not denying any of that. But he says, he raises an interesting question. He says, but can the man of the world, this mass illusion that nonetheless, despite all these teachings and all these teachers saying this, if you look at your own life, as well as the life of, the mass of humanity, people are living as if this individual self is quite important, and people are living as if fulfilling its desires and meeting its needs is important. And so he raises the question, is it simply that the mass of humanity is that completely deluded, or is there a kernel of truth to this? And what has been very satisfying to me is he says, yes, there is a kernel of truth, which is what he describes as personal essence. So he says that even on the essential level, there is a personal realization where there's a feeling of personal identity that is not simply a personality structure. Okay? So I don't have time to go into that a lot, but it's an interesting realization, a happy resolution to me, to that conflict. And that's what he says about the egoic level as a whole, that for every personality level quality is a fake version of something that's real. And so that becomes part of the inquiry, part of the process of discovering, is what is this false strength? False strength, like if you feel really an inner weakness and you're cut off from the aspect of essence that simply is strength, then you have to adapt by adopting a fake level of strength. And that is usually strength that is rigid, that is somehow against or over other people. There's a lot of different ways that we recognize false strength from true strength. But in order to go from the false to the true, you have to, one, be aware that it's false. You have to be willing to feel the inner deficiency that it's compensating for. That goes back to the awareness that the personality is inherently deficient. So you have to be willing. Adi Da used to say, I'm looking for people who have scraped the bottom of the barrel. It's like you have to finally get that the ego has done everything it can to be happy, and it still hasn't ultimately succeeded. And then you're finally willing to feel the fear or the deficiency, the emptiness inside that you've been distracting yourself from because of this animal level belief that your desire is going to be fulfilled by this external orientation. And you finally start to shift your allegiance inward instead of outward. Because essence is easily missed by an external obsession. But it takes that quiet turning within for you to begin to even notice essence. And the doorway is through noticing this emptiness. So with false strength, you have to finally be willing to feel the underlying feeling of weakness, which, believe me, we all have. We came in here as infants totally helpless. So at some level, we've experienced and been impressed by that. And so, but as you feel that, and most of us need loving help and support to feel that through a teacher or a counselor or a friend, some kind of safe space. But as you feel that deficiency, which initially feels like a pit, a hole that you don't want to fall into, and as you can tolerate feeling it, the magic is that inner deficiency in that hole that you've been trying to avoid is revealed to be space. Simply space, spaciousness itself. And in that space or spaciousness, your presence and whatever aspect of essence you're needing comes forth. And that is how the soul's journey then begins this process of recovery of all the different aspects of essence and recovery of our inherent nature as consciousness itself. Do you see that? So Almaas talks about not only what he calls the journey of ascent, but the journey of descent. So this moment of realization, self-realization, when you finally realize that you're not who you took yourself to be, is a very important moment. But in my experience and in Almaas's teaching, he says just because you've seen the light doesn't mean that all the egoic structures are going to dissolve permanently. And so he talks about self-realization being a twofold process. One is learning to abide as true nature, learning, therefore, not to buy into the story, but to abide as true nature, and to go through the process. This is the unfoldment, the process of letting all the structures be thinned out and returned back to that inner field of openness. And that's why you notice in the path of growth, how many people have noticed that you've spent years working on certain issues, and sooner or later that same issue or inner feeling seems to come up again? I remember years ago hearing Ram Dass talk and laugh about it. He talked about all the years of psychotherapy and drugs and being with his guru and everything he'd done. And he says, and not one neurosis did I get rid of. But he said, the only difference is they're not running my life anymore. See, and that becomes the difference. You don't change your basic egoic structure. Whatever your, say, Enneagram type is one way to understand personality structure. Whatever it is, you're not going to change that, which the ego kind of sets out thinking it'd like to do. But over repeated experience of feeling what is beyond that, it's like that structure becomes thinner and thinner and thinner, and the essential self, therefore, becomes more and more your actual reality. And the more that happens, the more the vibrant, inherent dynamism of the soul steps forward. And so then there's a momentum then. Then you find that the whole universe, in a certain sense, is supporting this momentum of returning to oneness. Okay? Does that make sense? I see that I'm coming up to the end of time, and I just want to take a minute. I think maybe I'll read a quote or two afterwards. Maybe the quotes aren't as important as I think, because I realize I want to come back. In case any of you are leaving at the break, I really want to bring forward this point again about the importance of the soul level in terms of our humanity. In the back, I have a place for you to sign up if you want to be on my mailing list, and a place to sign up if you want to come to my workshop, and I have some handouts that you can take. And if you read one of the handouts, which I have here someplace, I talk about inviting you to discover how to bring forth the goodness of the human heart and the greatness of the human spirit. And again, if you read the news or if you're honest about your own animal level self, in other words, I'm not pointing to a Pollyannish level of belief in human goodness, but the actual truth and the actual wonderful discovery is that inner goodness is the nature of the heart and of the soul. And I experienced that through the individual level work, a good many years ago. And so I've lived my life trusting that sense of inner goodness, that no matter how it looks on the outside, no matter how distorted or limited it's become, it is underneath a process of inner goodness looking for a way to come out and simply being distorted. It's like Adida used to say, everyone is vulnerable in need of love despite any appearance to the contrary. So you just begin to trust that. And Hellinger talks about that in the family constellation works. He says you always trust love is present. Love is the truth of our existence. You always trust that love is present in every family. You always trust that every child that is conceived in love. Okay? In the moment of conception, love is present. So you count on that, you trust on that. But it was through my participation in the Hellinger work that was really extended out. And I started to realize or to notice that, you would stand in as a representative, and maybe the constellation that was being set up was very difficult, where all sorts of abuse took place. And it didn't matter. At the end, your feeling was always one of feeling so honored to have participated. And so automatically, we don't talk in a family constellation workshop. You don't talk about presence. We don't even usually talk about compassion. And yet, to step into the field of someone's constellation and serve as a representative, the only thing you know to do is to be present and report on what shows up. So it automatically draws people into being present with and for one another. And inherently, out of that, this amazing compassion arises, and this amazing sense of honoring. And you really see, even in people who, again, aren't spiritually oriented, but on the soul level, when you experience them, there's this incredible sense of honoring. And at the end of one workshop I was participating in, not facilitating, but participating in, I found myself saying, I'm in awe of the human spirit. And what I realized is that over time, like the very first constellation I participated in, I was wowed by its power and its potential for healing. But it was only over time and over participating many times in many ways that this whole awareness and heart knowing of the great inner goodness of the human heart and the greatness of the human spirit, and that includes everyone, includes people that aren't spiritually aware, but who nonetheless, on the soul level, when you experience it, this is what you're left feeling. And I suddenly remembered a talk I'd gone to many years ago, some of you have heard me mention this before, by Thomas Berry, where he talked about the real crisis on the planet is not an energy crisis of oil or something like that, although there is that crisis. But it's a psychic energy level. It's a crisis of the human spirit. Do we feel capable? Do we feel willing? Do we have the capacity to respond to the crisis we're faced with? And suddenly, through this work, I suddenly realized that it has the capacity to call forth that human level response. It has the capacity to tap and unleash the goodness of the human heart and the greatness of the human spirit. And that is a soul level demonstration that we greatly need and that is completely possible. And so that's part of what my passion is whatever level we're working with, and we haven't really directly addressed these, although they exist, is so powerful, and it's so much what the world needs, in my opinion. So I hope that most of you can stay until after the, after the break, and we'll take more questions, and I'll try to share some quotes, and we'll do a meditation. But even if you have to leave now, just take with you this awareness that there is this inherent goodness that no matter how distorted it's become is looking for a way out, and that there are these awarenesses of how we can facilitate its movement to flow more freely on the planet. So I think I'm going to end there, and then we'll pick up again after the break.
Includes a lot of different chakras, all the chakras, right? Or is it? The Bailey path, or the Nature of the Soul path that I once tried, they were just talking about having most of your attention be at heart chakra, ajna, and crown. And then the other chakras would kind of like open and pull up on their own, that sort of thing. I don't know if you deal with chakras and rays in your work or not. Your path seems to be more gentle and less forcing than what I was exposed to.
Yes, this is definitely a path about allowing and curiosity and inquiry, really. And being gently with yourself in your experience. Very much more that than trying in any kind of muscular way to create a change or impose a change. And so, for instance, in the attunement work, we were taught that you never on your own try to activate chakras. But as an automatic byproduct of simply being present and allowing this unfoldment to occur, chakras are activated. But that was like never the focus of an attunement session. That's just like, a side aspect of something that happens, but it's not the focus of what happens. And the orientation is that the chakras, it's kind of like your soul knows better than your personality does what needs to happen, when it needs to happen, how it needs to happen. So the idea is to get your personality out of the way as much as possible and allow the inherent wisdom of the soul and of the self to come forward. That's part of the, when we talk about these inherent properties of the soul, one is the capacity to be aware. So what needs to be known comes up through being present. You don't have to figure it out ahead of time. And that's true at all these levels, at the family level as well. You don't have to figure it out. So that part is true. It's a very, and I mentioned how the attunement work was part of what my sole purpose was at the time, not to get the PhD, but to do this other work that would really open the heart. There were many reasons for that, and one is that it was a very feminine approach. And part of my journey was about really attuning to the divine feminine. And I forget who it was, but someplace I remember reading a quote that says something like, in relationship to God, we're all female. Now, you can look at that or take offense at that in various ways, but I think what it was pointing to is this notion of the need to be receptive. And receptivity is normally associated with the feminine. But receptivity is, that's another word we could put here along with impressionability, malleability, sensitivity, is receptivity. So the whole shift in freeing up is to allow the sensitivity, not to try to protect yourself and say this world is too harsh and I've got to, protect myself, which is what we've all already done. It's to become more and more impressionable and sensitive, but to essence. Do you see what I mean? So you shift away from that outer orientation of my needs are going to be met out here. You shift your allegiance to the inner orientation of allowing essence to come forward. And the way you do that is through this receptivity. And so it is a process then, it's a very gentle process of becoming receptive and being with your experience. And certain levels, certain deep levels really can only come up when there's a great degree of empathy and inner attunement. They're just not going to reveal themselves otherwise. So, there are degrees that you want to go to in growth. Some people just want to heal enough to be able to be relatively happier and more present, and that's fine, that's good. But, if you want to talk about the whole way or the whole potential, you have to be willing for all of these primitive structures to come up. So that takes that willingness to keep being receptive to what's arising rather than imposing your idea of what it should be or where you should be in the process. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, over and over again, in the attunement work, in this work, you see, again, it's that shift because the you that's trying to do it can't really do it. But when you're simply present, what needs to come through can come through. That's the great gift. So go ahead.
Hi, it's me again. I have a sort of a question / observation that relates somewhat to what I was talking about before. And it's been intriguing me for a long time now, which is why I'm delving into this some more. And that is, it seems to me like as a culture that we are addicted to feeling good. And
addicted to what?
To feeling good.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so if our real commitment is to feel good at all costs, then we're willing to do almost anything to avoid feeling bad, quote unquote. And it spawned a whole bunch of technologies and ideologies, it seems like to me, like like focusing our attention on the positive, the power of positive thinking. And there's just all kinds of variants of this theme, like if you want something, put all your intention and all your focus of your attention on that particular object of desire and keep it there, and you'll manifest it, kind of thing. So we hear this kind of ideology over and over and over again. And it seems to me like this is really an insidious thing in a way, because if Bly's right, and we keep putting our shadow into the bag all the time, and then by the time we're at midlife, we're, hauling around this 100-yard bag, and it keeps getting caught in elevators and stuff like that. Then when we do try to be open to what's in the bag, then it's so toxic by that point that, we end up in the psych ward if we try opening it. And so this has not been a question as much as a commentary, I suppose, but I would like your observations about that. It seems to me really a really fundamental difference in two approaches. One says, learn early on about facing whatever is there, whatever is real, and be it good, bad, or so-called or ugly, whatever. And then this other one that says, no, focus on your preferred state or your preferred object of desire.
Yes, I agree with you, and that's where it comes back in a way to what to this devotion to truth. And Adidal used to say, truth is a process, and the I is a process, and the process of this truth and the process of this I is one and the same. That's kind of an interesting way to think of it. But it gets to this notion that, again, it's a truth that is present in every moment, and that you inquire into how you're showing up in any moment to allow the truth to be revealed. So yes, the addiction to feeling good, like many things, you can look at it paradoxically, because it's perfectly normal and natural that we all want to be happy. And so it goes back to that man of the world who wants to be happy in the world, wants to have a life, wants to have talents and resources and friends, and all of that is good and natural. But the great tragedy is the failure to understand how to go about achieving that. And we're incredibly stubborn and persistent in trying over and over and over again something that doesn't work. That you can look all around you and see the evidence for the fact that it doesn't work, but somehow you find yourself showing up one more time to give it a go, that if I can just get it right, get more money, or get the right relationship, or get my body in shape, or whatever it is, the devotion to trying to somehow make it come out the way you want it to is quite strong. So that imprint has been made at a very, very basic level in the soul. That's why you have to have a lot of compassion with yourself if you want to let all that come up. But you're right, you have to be devoted to the truth. The truth has to be more important than feeling good, has to be more important than how you prefer it to be. And as it turns out, truth is inherently satisfying to the soul. That's why if you set up a constellation, even if it's a really difficult constellation, there's somehow people feel a certain relief just in seeing the truth of their family revealed in this, constellation. There's something freeing about finally seeing, okay, yeah, that is the way it was. That is the way it feels. And that truth itself is inherently satisfying. And that begins this process of discovery then, where you gradually begin to shift your allegiance again to truth, to discovering the truth of your experience. Who cares if, Christ realized certain things if we don't realize it ourselves? And so you can't just read that someone else has said this and believe them, although that's helpful, to at least it sometimes helps create the possibility. But you still have to discover it for yourself for it to be real. And any incremental experience of that is inherently satisfying. So Almaas has a term, he talks about metabolizing our experience. He says we've all had many experiences, but a lot of times we're not in a place to be able to fully metabolize it. And it's only if you metabolize it that it becomes food, it becomes nourishment that you can actually take in and become then part of your soul richness. Okay? That's another shift in allegiance that he talks about. He says, you know, there's a value to having a teacher. I mean, I will bow in gratitude to my teachers, and I'm not at all putting out the viewpoint that says, you know, the ego can do it on its own and doesn't need teachers. So, you know, I bow to teachers and what they help us with. But nonetheless, he talks about making this basic transit of allegiance, that you have to begin giving your own essence the credit. That even if a teacher is helping you, it's your essence that has brought that teacher to you. And he says if you shift and you make that allegiance to your own essence, that essence then will allow to unfold and make that realization your own. And of course, then it goes beyond the small, you know, the small individual self, of course. But still, there's all sorts of ways you can look at it. As long as I'm on that roll, I don't think it's particularly on that question, but another way that you can look at you know, this process is, Almaas will talk about it in terms of the recovery of trust. So one way he defines enlightenment as 100% enlightenment is 100% trust. And so if you experience where, you know, there are parts and experiences where you trust, and then there are those places where you don't trust. And it's the recovery of the ability of trusting in the inherent nature of reality itself, and that you are not separate from that. That becomes a very workable, useful way to think about it, doesn't it? You know? So, okay, that's enough on that line. Anyone else have a question or something you want me to address?
Yeah, I had a question about, you mentioned, what? Hold it up close. Okay, here we go. I had a question about, you said the soul learns, and it didn't seem to ring a bell to me like the soul learns. That I guess I feel like the body learns and the mind learns, and the soul like knows, and the soul seems to me to be something apart from a learning situation. In other words, things can happen, or you get all this stuff from the outside trying to tell you what to do and everything. But the soul, to me, seems to stand aside from that and to see, it seems to be more in an area of truth, that the soul is truth, and that the soul doesn't learn. The soul can reflect truth, but the soul doesn't learn like things that aren't true. Which, do you see where I'm going with that? That's, you know, when you said the soul learns, you know, from the outside and all this, it doesn't seem to ring true to me that the soul learns, that it's more like the soul is, and the soul is part of truth, but learning comes through the body or through the instincts or through the physical.
Right. You know, somewhat we can, you know, somewhat it could become semantics, but again, so what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to use your question and comment as a lead-in to reading a quote. I've already tried to express this in my own words, but maybe this fairly short quote from Almaas will help clarify it. So this is the way we're using it. This is, by the way, this is just from a section where he's talking about the living presence as one of the properties of the soul, okay? And it's that living presence that he then says leads to growth. And so in that section, he has a little line that says, essence is eternally itself. It does not grow, and growth makes no sense to it. This is a very important distinction between soul and essence, regardless of the fact that both are consciousness. Essence is pure consciousness, but the soul is an organism of pure consciousness. Essence is always complete and perfect, but soul grows and develops. Completeness and perfection is her deepest potential, but she needs to grow for this to be her permanent conscious condition. Okay? I'm skipping now a little bit. Direct recognition of the ultimate truth does not by itself bring about enlightenment and liberation. In fact, the soul cannot actually absorb the significance and the implications of such experience all at once. She needs a continual process of development in which she grows and matures, and the fullness of this maturation will then coincide with the capacity to abide in the primordial perfection. This process of unfoldment and learning is the process of growing and developing the inner vessel needed for our essential nature to manifest in a lived human life. So that's one of the ways he talks about soul, is it's the inner vessel. So it kind of starts to get, a soul is also the level of story and symbolism. So the whole symbolism of the Grail as the vessel of the soul is an interesting tie-in here. I don't really want to go down that road, but I'll just throw that out. So do you see that distinction? I don't know whether it's one you accept, but that's the way I understand it. That's my experience, and that's how I work with it, is essence doesn't grow, soul does. And that's the unfoldingness. So in terms of when you say the body, as a little girl growing up in a Christian church, when I heard the word soul or heard about soul, it was more like the soul would live in the body, and when the body died, the soul would leave. But a more accurate description in the actual experience goes back to this field of awareness, that the soul is a field of awareness that the body lives in. It isn't that the soul lives in the body, but the body lives in the soul as this field of awareness, okay? So, that's just one of those little twists or turns. Do you mind at this point if I just read another little quote? This isn't exactly on the point of the soul growing, but you know how I said I wanted to get to the difference between the images we have in spirituality of a saint or a guru, or what it means to be a realized person, which is usually angelic or, some ideal of perfection. And what we're pointing to here, which is kind of the fullness of a human life that is lived in this awareness of being this source or this being, but yet living as a human being. So that goes back to the integration of the animal soul, the human soul, the angelic soul, that a fully realized human being has integrated these levels, all of which are expressions from Source. So he had a little paragraph that I liked. This is further along in the book now, and he's talked about the soul's journey and how it comes to realize unity. And he's talking about the point at which the search loses its momentum. Not because you mentally understand that you can call off the search, as Papaji always said, but that the actual drive, the actual inner lack of fulfillment that was driving the search has finally ebbed away, because you've realized at least enough of essence that you no longer have this restless searching. And so he's talking about the soul, refers to the soul in feminine. So it says, now she is home, and the reason for her search is gone. It is gone because she does not feel the seeking energy anymore. The seeking energy is simply the tension of separation and of the longing for love of the union. Fulfillment now saturates her experience, and she begins to experience a new order of contentment. Her contentment and happiness cease to be primarily caused by life happenings, in other words, things outside yourself, for it is now the natural condition of the heart that has found its beloved. She feels mature, ripened, and free. She feels herself as the Ipsity, with its immeasurable depth, luminous vastness, and blissful intimacy. Even this sense gradually and subtly passes away as the soul abides in the mystery of the Absolute. As we become accustomed to this condition, it becomes more ordinary and simple. The soul feels she is a complete but ordinary human being. She is aware of her nature as to the inscrutable Absolute, but she feels completely ordinary and normal. There is no sense of the extraordinary, while in fact the self-realization of the absolute ipsity is quite an unusual realization. The sense of the big deal is due to the initial excitement of discovery, But after that, with the ripening, one feels simple and ordinary and recognizes that the Absolute is simplicity itself. It is so simple that it is absolutely nothing. It is so simple that it is impossible to know. The mind needs some complexity, some discrimination to discern and know. When the experience is of an absolute simplicity, there is nothing for the soul to know. This simplicity appears as simplicity of behavior, attitude, and speech. One is ordinary and appreciates the ordinary, for the most ordinary is the simplicity of the Absolute. The simplicity may develop to the station of the invisible sage. The invisible sage, the highest station, the sage who appears as a normal, simple human being, but whose innerness is the luminous mystery of the Absolute. I think personally that is so much more of a healthy image to hold out than trying to be a saint or a guru or, put spirituality, making someone on a pedestal. It's this realization of the most ordinary. So I wanted to share that. And I have another quote I want to share, but I'll let that come in a minute. All right, any other? We're still going to keep time for the meditation, so we're going to have to shift soon. Yes?
How does essence correspond to the absolutes?
Yeah, that's a good question. Essence, the way I can talk about it initially is that essence is of the Absolute, let's say. But you experience it initially usually at a personal presence level. And it has, he talks about it in terms of having many aspects. So that if you've been relying on egoic strength and you can get to the underlying deficiency under that, then inherent strength has the ability to manifest because that's an aspect of essence. So essence has many aspects: love, closeness, strength, value. You know how we're always noticing that we don't feel worthy or that we have this sense, and so people try to feel more worthy. But there isn't anything externally that actually can give you that worthiness, but value is an inherent quality or aspect of essence. So you can allow that aspect to come forward. So essence has these aspects that you experience as you're uncovering and being with the egoic deficiencies, okay? Whereas the Absolute is when all sense of self and limitation falls away, and it's the complete oneness where the individual self really doesn't exist.
Ego, by that you mean the absence or the denial of the essence or the absolutes?
So the understanding, and this is space. Remember how I said you experience the deficiency and it feels like a hole or a pit, something you're avoiding. And then if you can tolerate the tension of being with it, then it becomes space. And in that space, essence and whatever is needed manifests. And we talked about that you don't change the egoic structure. It simply becomes more permeable, becomes less rigid, less filling up the space, so that in a sense you become more and more spacious. Well, if you look at it the other way, ego is the structures of who we take ourselves to be that fill up the spaciousness of our true being. And that was my first, this is an earlier book. This book, which is really about the soul level, I waited a long time for this to come out. I had done work with Almaas, and he had talked about the soul, and I was doing the soul level work in the attunement, but it wasn't published anyplace. And I was like, where can I get this? And he's like, well, eventually, a book will come out talking about it. Well, books kept coming out, and this one only came out recently. So this is the soul level one. It's very, very useful. But this one, Pearl Beyond Price, was an earlier book, also brilliant. And this is where he talks more about that split between man of the world and man of spirit. And to get back to your point then, this book is a brilliant, you have to really kind of like psychology to get into this in a way. But Almaas has the inner perception of of being self-realized. And he has a very precise understanding of psychology, including how does a separate sense of self develop in infancy. Because when a child is born, the infant does not experience itself or know itself separate from its environment. The sense of separation and the sense of being a separate someone is actually a developmental achievement. and is very useful, and what he's done is he's studied the process of infancy and childhood and how the sense of self develops. And he says it literally becomes a mental construct in the spacious field of the soul. And then pretty soon we're feeling that construct and not the spacious field anymore, okay? So that's the reverse way to look at it, and very useful to look at how that develops. And that's where if at the time when you're, feeling like there's a stage, say, when a child is learning how that it can be away from mother, that wonderful stage where they first are wanting to get away from mom, and then all of a sudden they notice, oh my God, and then they scramble back to be close to mom. That, he says, creates this, what's called, psychologists call the reapproachment conflict, which is the need, the desire, the part of you that wants to be autonomous from mom, the part of you that wants to be autonomous and independent, and then the part of you that wants to be close and to know that you're going to be okay and cared for. And so he looks at that stage of development, and he says, depending on what happens to you and how your parents handle that and what else is going on in your life will impact on how you resolve that. So in other words, his teaching, what I'm saying, gets very particular, very clarifying, of very precise stages of growth. And then what we do in the process of spiritual growth or realization is kind of reverse that process. Do you see what I'm saying? So I don't know whether I've clarified or muddied it, but that's what came up for me with your question. And if it's not clear, maybe talk to me afterwards and I'll see if I can help clarify it any. But
where is he from, Almaas?
He's Middle Eastern by birth, and he's lived in the United States for a long time, and he has a school that's called the Diamond Heart School, and it's based in Berkeley and Boulder are the two places. As far as what country he was born in, I always forget. I remember he's Middle Eastern, but I don't remember the country. He might be from Iraq, but I'm not really sure, to tell you the truth. I just know he's Middle Eastern.
I believe he's from Iran.
I don't think so, but I could be wrong. Doesn't really matter in terms of our work here, but anyway, he's Middle Eastern and American now. So anything else? So what I'd like to do, I'm going to go ahead and read this one other quote. I'm wondering how we can best do the meditation. I guess I wish we could be close enough to be in a circle, but I don't think we can really do that. But if everyone could maybe kind of move a little bit forward when we do this. I have no idea how this is going to go, but we'll do a meditation and see. Are you game for another quote or two? Is that? So this is from a chapter on reality, where he's talking about, again, this is kind of the complete man or the invisible sage that he's described. He has just beautiful description of freedom and what freedom is really about and how it's inherently tied to the life of service. And I'm just going to read the very last part of it. The greatest development of the soul is to serve the Absolute by expressing it. To be an instrument of the Absolute is to be its absolute servant, which is the same as being a complete, thoroughly ripened and mature human adult. This is human happiness and fulfillment. This is the station of the realization of the freedom vehicle, which is the reason we frequently refer to it as the body of service. We develop a new subtle body, which inherently recognizes its function as servicing the truth of reality. It is a precise, clear, totally objective wisdom, completely free from subjective bias or reaction. I'm going to skip a little. Our freedom is that we are the absolute in its mystery, but at the same time, we are also the individual soul with all of her development, life, and maturation. We are essence with all of its dimensions and aspects, but we are also the human being with its perishable body, corruptible mind, and an inconstant heart. So I'm going to try, hopefully by being hooked up here, it's a little strange way to guide the meditation, but if at any point my voice drops too much and you can't hear me, just say something and I'll try to remember to speak louder. Is there any way we can lower some of the lights for this? Lower, turn partial off. We don't want to be in the dark, but yeah, that feels better.
Camera-wise, you okay?
We'll make it work.
Okay. Yeah, we don't need to be in the dark, but it just seems easier to go inward if you're not totally. So, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what comes up in the meditation, because I won't guide this, I'll just track what I notice happening, but it could be that this is the part where we'll go into the world soul. We'll see. Mm-hmm. So just begin that shift of allegiance to the inner, and not trying to change anything about what your experience is or how you're showing up, but just being curious to check inside and notice. And take a moment to be aware of your heart center. And silently within your heart, just make the request. I ask my soul to emerge and guide my experience. And in noticing the multidimensional fields of the soul, just let your awareness also be aware of this room and the mystery of has brought this particular group of people together. And take a moment to be aware of your inner core, as if there were a shaft of light, so to speak, coming right down through the crown of your head, right down through the core of your being, extending below the body and anchoring down into the earth. Just feel that inner core. And in the interconnectivity of the soul, notice how this inner core connects down into the core of the earth and extends upwards into what we symbolically call heaven. And allow the field of your awareness now to grow to encompass the whole planet. Feeling oneness with the world soul. See if you can notice that the rhythm and the beating of your own heart begins to beat in sync with the rhythm of the pulse of the earth. And invite into your awareness now, not only your own individual heart and the heart of the earth, invite into your awareness the whole human family and the human heart. As we're staying present with this, allow into your awareness, particularly awareness now of the divine feminine. Just allowing that to continue to be present. Notice now and invite in the awareness of the divine masculine, its basic polarity. Inwardly now, just acknowledging the happy marriage, the happy balance, the inner marriage of masculine and feminine. And feel and notice the heart fullness, this gives rise to. Notice that the human heart can expand to literally hold the entire planet within its heart. And just feel that sense of embracing this precious planet we call home. Just feel and notice whatever your heart's prayer is in this moment. May all beings be at peace. And notice now there's an ancestral energy that's kind of manifesting. It's not really so much about individual ancestors as it is about ancestral wisdom, the collective soul wisdom of those who have lived on the planet, lived at a time in closer oneness with nature and with the natural world. Just invite into your awareness the ancestral wisdom of how to be caretakers of this planet. Inviting into your awareness the mineral kingdom and the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom and the planet herself. Feeling your soul infused with the awareness, the wisdom of how to care and live wisely in this place. See if there's a particular soul awareness that wants to come through to you. Something that you need to do, something that your soul purpose is involved with. And just be receptive to that. Notice the rich kind of inner communication that occurs. Affirming now our soul capacity to care for this planet. Feeling the planet herself, the world soul, infusing and informing. Invoking the greatness of the human spirit. Notice how that greatness has complete room for an acceptance of the smallness. All aspects, part of the totality. Just notice how much love is emanating from the heart as the heart. And then come even lower in the energy body and be aware of the belly center. And simply reside as the presence, unmoving, beautiful presence, stillness. Notice now the vastness. Notice the mystery, the unfathomable, endless mystery. Just inwardly, if you feel ready, just acknowledge your allegiance to the mystery. And feel that vastness of the mystery now as the vastness and the spaciousness of your own heart, your own being. And begin to allow your awareness to come back into this room, back into a closer association with your body. May all beings know themselves as this mystery of love. So as you feel ready, you can begin to open your eyes. We spoke earlier of that natural human desire to be happy, and the tragedy being that we don't know how to truly find happiness. And Adida wrote a book for children. It applies to all of us. He says the surest way to be happy is to remember the mystery. So I think we'll close the evening with that mystery. I honor each of you. So glad we've had this time together. Thank you very much.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.